So I want to welcome everyone and thank all of you for being here tonight. Thank our panelists for being here tonight. It's, in case you didn't know, it's 4 days before Pesach. So the fact that you're here, it could mean one of two things. It could mean you're taking a break from your preparations, or maybe you haven't started. But thank you for making time to be here. And I wanted to also just say a word about, before we jump in, I wanted to say a word about context, about what we're hoping will happen, why this has emerged from an internal process here at Beth El. These are challenging times for all types of legacy institutions in America. This is a challenging time for legacy institutions within the conservative movement. And we have internally here at Beth El embarked on a process, a visioning process, a strategic planning process to help us, creatively reimagine what it means to be a successful conservative synagogue in 2018. And one of the salient questions that has reemerged over and over in the conversations that we've been having, both as a visioning team and within the larger synagogue conversations that we're having around this process, is a question of what it really means to be a conservative Jew. And this question is often answered in the negative. It's not Orthodox, and it's not Reform. Or I grew up Orthodox and my partner grew up Reform, so we figured we would join a conservative synagogue. But when you really try to build community around vision and mission and instill in people a passion for what it is that we're trying to achieve in life together as a community, but you can't actually name who you are and what the values are that animate you and give life to all of the things that you're doing, there's just no way to survive, not in 2018 and not in the coming future. So this process, tonight is a conversation meant to really address those questions that have organically emerged, that cut to the core of our identity as a synagogue that has identified with the conservative movement since its beginning, and wants to ask the question, as we move forward, what does that actually mean to us today, and does it make sense for us to continue to identify around this sort of key question of how we see ourselves in the Jewish community and in the world? So I wanted to say a few things about the vision. So the vision team has been working really hard on creating lots of learning journeys for the larger community so that we can investigate whatever questions arise organically through this process. We take them seriously, and we try not to stack the deck when we do the learning and when we do the exploration. So I want to first ask if there's anyone who's on the vision team, if you'd stand up for a moment just so we can see your faces, and thank you for your commitment to this process and to the synagogue. Thank you. And I wanted to say a word about the rules for tonight. We like rules. So everyone, see, this is a green card. This is a green card. And as the evening unfolds, if you have a question that you feel you want to ask, just raise your hand, and someone will come around and give you the card. And when you're finished writing your question down, you can just hold it up in the air, and someone will come and collect it. And we'll be moderating. We'll go through these questions, and I'll have an opportunity to choose some of the questions that I think will help us really dive deep, and I'll share some of those questions on your behalf. I just want to say a word about the values of this process. One of the things that we're trying to do through Journey is cultivate the practice of listening and curiosity. So as soon as you have a question, the first thing that you should do is decide not to raise your hand. Just sit with the question for a minute and ask yourself what it is that you really need to learn through this question, and in fact, do you really need to ask the question? Because I have no doubt that if you decide, if you're disciplined and you realize, that was an instinct I had, but it's not really pressing, you'll have another question that will emerge shortly, I'm sure. So the other piece is you may hear things from our panelists that just don't sit right with you. They may challenge you. They may challenge some of the assumptions you have about who we have been as a movement or what our ideology stands for moving forward. So just notice the feeling, the oppositional feeling that you have, and maybe there's something that will unfold around that feeling and around that issue, and that would be a good issue to ask a question about. So I am going to, this is a word for our panelists, that the other value that has been guiding us on this path and this process, this visioning process, is that we really are trying to get to the heart of the matter. So we as a community appreciate that you're giving us your time and that you're sharing your own stories and perceptions of who we have been and where we're headed and how we ought to get there. And we just want to invite you to also share your vulnerable selves with us and to not just not just offer the easy answer, but that we've invited you out because we believe that there'll be a diversity of opinion, and it's through that diversity of opinion and the challenges that you may present to one another that I think this community will grow from. So I'm going to you have the full bios on your seats. I'm not going to read them, but I will just read one line about each person. So Rabbi Stephen Wernick is the CEO of United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism and is the most senior rabbinic leader of the conservative movement. And Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay is the Associate Dean of the JTS Rabbinical School and has devoted her rabbinic career to social issues around social justice. Rabbi Adina Lewis, Rabbi Aaron Brusso is the rabbi of Beit Torah in Mount Kisco, New York, and is a member of the Executive Council of the Rabbinical Assembly and the JTS Chancellor's Rabbinic Cabinet. And Rabbi Adina Lewis is the founder of Shar Communities in Bergen County, New Jersey, and is on the rabbinic team at B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan. And I have personal connections to everyone on the panel, but that doesn't really matter, I guess, for us. So let's jump in. Let's just start with, if each of you had an opportunity to distill the answer to the question that I opened with, which is to say, how do you define the truest values that animate our communities today and moving into the future? How would you answer that question in the positive? In other words, not defining us by what we're not, but defining us by both what we are and what we aspire to be. And I want to just say that I don't want to make any assumptions about our panelists. I think everyone on this panel has either worked within or been shaped by the conservative movement. And each identity of the individual panelists about whether they consider themselves continued leaders within the conservative movement or not, I leave that up to our panelists to offer up if they'd like. But let's just start with that opening question. And whoever would like to speak, feel free to jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think that the values that animate the conservative movement today have been the values that have animated the conservative movement since our inception. The way in which they may be sort of manifest today may be a source of struggle as we encounter difficult issues, but I think those values include an incredibly important relationship between tradition and change, as we've always spoken about it. But what that means, I think, is an evolutionary, dynamic understanding of how religion and spirituality evolve over the course of generations as the world changes. I think our commitment to halachic pluralism, to being able to be in community with others who practice in ways that may be different from our practice, but nonetheless see the overarching bonds that maintain our sense of unity with one another, I think that distinguishes us. I think our acknowledgement, and not just acknowledgement, but embrace of what I would call theological humility distinguishes us. An awareness of the fact that none of us knows exactly what it is that we are called to either believe or practice, and that we are fundamentally committed to living the most righteous lives that we're capable of living. I think our ability to embrace diversity, as I mentioned before, not only halachic diversity, but also diversity in the sense of what it means to live a Jewish life and the many and manifold ways in which Judaism is lived, distinguishes us. And finally, I would say our commitment to spiritual audacity and moral courage. I think those are things that have animated the conservative movement. We have led over the course of the last many, many decades on some urgent issues in American life, and we have the ongoing capacity to do so. That's how I would answer that question.
Thank you.
So I agree with everything that was just said. I want to just add a couple things to that. In today's discourse, I don't believe the conversation is about identity. I think identity already becomes limiting and creates boundaries. And so I think that to be successful today, we have to speak in a language of what are our shared goals and practices. And so the values question is really key to that. I would go a little bit further than Dini did. I would say that these values are not just the values that have animated conservative Judaism since its inception. I would say these are the values that have animated Judaism since its inception. And that's part of the conversation. We have to stop. If we're living in a post, I actually think it's a meta-denominational world, then we have to stop defining success by metrics that are no longer relevant to an idea of shared goals and shared practices and beliefs and so forth. And so you can see that USCJ has very specifically done that with the new branding that it's done, which is not about marketing and advertising. Branding is about who you are and how you communicate that. We've conflated our name from the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism to USCJ. We want to become the IBM of Jewish organizations, where everybody knows what IBM is, but few people, except for maybe those in this room, actually remember what the initials stand for. And so that was done intentionally in order to take out the conversation of the word conservative, and quite frankly, to take out the conversation of the word synagogue. A synagogue is a building, a community is a home. And so we want to refocus people's attention for those who share the values, the beliefs, the practices that were just enumerated, and then more, as being an authentic and dynamic Jewish approach to life fulfillment and wisdom. We want to have that conversation be about kehillah, about community, about the way in which we interact with each other on the human level, individually and community.
I'll add. So I would add to what Dini said about a sense of being called, but I think it's also a sense of commandedness, which is language that sort of fits very well with our sense of conservative Judaism. But I also think that I think conservative Judaism has sort of transformed itself historically. It's just really hard to live through the transformation. And so we're at a moment of change, but I think conservative Jewish life has always been in conversation with modernity and trying to figure out how do we take a traditional perspective and adapt it to the world we actually live in. It's hard to do. And then the last piece I want to add is around social justice. I think our movement has had a commitment to justice. We didn't brand it as well as some other movements, but in the re-envisioning of ourselves for the future, I hope social justice is a piece in a conservative movement way that's rooted in text, it's rooted in tradition. That'll be part of how we think about ourselves for the future.
So 20 years ago, Khan and I were married here, and I'm realizing that this is where she sat in the white wicker chair right here. Very strange thing to be sitting here. I want to acknowledge first that I'm incredibly grateful to this movement for helping shape me into the person I am today. The institutions were there for me when I needed them. And I could just talk about the panel. Rabbi Wernick and our work with the Rabbinical Assembly Strategic Planning and how important those group of people are and those friendships and connections. Rabbi Resquet and I, the time we staffed USY Israel Pilgrimage and how powerful those experiences were in shaping who we are. And Rabbi Lewidis, incredible mentor and dean of mine when I was at JTS. All these institutions, I owe unbelievable debts of gratitude, and to one of them still some debt, actually.
I'll forgive it.
Yeah. I'm going to tell Arnie.
So I want to say that I'm not speaking here for the movement when I talk about what is a meaningful vision here, except to say that I've been profoundly shaped by those institutions. So what I try to do in my rabbinate is essentially the story of Egypt and Sinai. I believe very strongly that Egypt teaches us that God saw us when we were least likely to be seen. We were lost and completely forgotten in a land that could care less. And God cared, saw us, and appreciated who we were. That's the first move, I think, for any of us, is that when we encounter another person, we attempt to see them for who they are, appreciate them for who they are, without projecting anything onto them in terms of who we think they should be. The next move is Sinai, to bring people into a sense of meaning and purpose and connecting to things larger than themselves. That's what we try to do in our community. First and foremost, see and appreciate people and help to bring them into a community in which they can live a life of purpose, meaning, and attach themselves to things bigger than themselves.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on something that Rabbi Lewidis said, and I think is a very live issue for us here at Beth El. And it's the idea that halachic pluralism is a kind of staple or foundational element of our movement. One of the things that I am learning since I've come to Beth El is that there are a lot of people within our community who feel on principle that there should be one representative way of living out religious life within Beth El. Forget outside of Beth El, but within Beth El, anyone who walks into the doors should know these are our values around, let's say, kind of a religious vision for what Shabbat morning services should look like or Friday night services should look like. And we have a responsibility to communicate the right way that we believe this should look. And introducing the idea that as a movement we have multiple ways of expressing halachic and religious life, I guess the larger question is, does it make sense for a community to say that that religious or halachic pluralism could actually be reflected within one community with multiple ways of expressing those truths? That's not only for Rabbi Lewidis, but it emerged from her question and kind of is on my agenda here at Beth El. Does everyone understand the question? Yes? Great.
I think the answer to your question hinges on how a community understands itself and its purpose. If the community's purpose is to represent one of the myriad ways in which Jewish life is lived and observed, then you might be led to think that there is a responsibility to showcase that this is the Jewish life that this community embodies and this community believes that its purpose is to perpetuate. But if a synagogue's mission is to be a welcoming space for people who are on various journeys of understanding what it is that puts fire in their belly Jewishly, and they're looking for fellowship, and they're looking for learning, and they're looking for multiple opportunities to live in relationship to ritual and to observance, then the community's framework ought to, I think, have the capacity to nurture people on whatever journey they may find themselves. I think I'm the oldest on this panel, and I was in rabbinical school 30 years ago, and I was trained in a very specific approach whereby my ordination charged me to go out there and to inspire people to learn to live my Jewish life. And consequently, there were many decisions that I was tasked to make as a rabbi that required me to draw the line over issues where people were perhaps departing from me. For example, for 18, 15 years, right, I was trained and I dutifully observed the restriction against officiating at any life cycle events that were not being catered by a certified kosher caterer. And eventually, if you're interested in the story, it's actually an amazing story. I won't take up time telling you it, but I learned very painfully that the measure of my success as a rabbi is not going to be gauged by how many people I succeed in turning into little versions of me. That I'm very confident and very comfortable in my Jewish life, which continues to grow as I continue to learn and evolve. But the measure of my success as a rabbi is going to be gauged by how many people I can successfully and effectively and inspirationally connect with their own self-understanding as Jews and motivate them to make deep and abiding investments in their Jewish life, even if their Jewish lives might not look exactly like mine looks. So I think the answer to your question hinges on your self-understanding. Why are you a community? Towards what end? What are your goals? What do you want to achieve, both in a collective sense, and also on behalf of each of the individuals who calls this place home?
Practically speaking, I would add that it's also kind of a luxury to be able to say that we're going to have a community that all does this, and if you don't want to sort of do it this way, you can go to a different place and start it. Like that doesn't seem to be the reality where we're starting loads of shuls now in this movement in Westchester. I feel like it's an opportunity. I worked at Avodah for a number of years when I finished rabbinical school, which focuses, it's a domestic Jewish Peace Corps, and there's an intentional living component to it. And so young adults live together in a house, and they all have social justice and social service jobs. And they spend a lot of time talking about who's going to clean the bathroom, what kind of cheese are we going to have in the kitchen, and how are they going to do this with intentionality, not just be roommates, but be people who decide we want to come together to create a certain kind of community. And our belief in that program was that people who did that hard work would really know how to build communities out in the world and be able to be part of synagogues where everybody didn't have to sort of agree on everything, but you could find like what were the values that we agree enough upon that we could come together for this. We might do some different things in our lives, but there's enough value in being together. And my sense is that that is a useful thing to think about in what should Shabbat look like, or what should communal space look like. It might not be what you do at home, but it might be what holds you together, which is maybe more important than everyone doing what you do.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think if you've got a community that's expressing halakhic pluralism where You've got people doing things in different ways. That's actually a sign of a vibrant community. I think you could see it as a community that's divided or conflicted. I don't see it that way at all. I see people who are expressing passions in different ways, and I think that can only add overall to the passion of the community. I think it's great.
So I would just add a couple things to this conversation. The first is, I'm assuming you have like a junior congregation or a kid service or a family service or something like that. So let's get real that we're already offering multiple portals of entry, and that the reason we do that is because we recognize that there's different stages of development by which people both acquire and experience and celebrate Jewish life. So why would we think that that doesn't continue even into adulthood, where people are coming from different starting places and different spiritual needs, and that we're somehow like afraid to divide the community rather than to think about how do we help people. I really liked Aaron's language of like, of recognizing people and then connecting them, right? Of Exodus and Sinai. That's great. I'm going to take it, by the way. Why would we think that that somehow that like diminishes us? That's the first thing, right? Is I wanted to point out that you're already doing it, right? Because the recognition of doing a kid service is already, or a family service is already an alternative service, because the people who come have different needs that need to be recognized. That's one. Two is, the beauty of our tradition is the preservation of the minority opinion, right? What makes Judaism so terrific is that the Talmud, the halachic literature, is by its very definition pluralistic and dynamic, right? And therefore, what makes Judaism authentic is the recognition that there are multiple approaches to how we find holiness in our lives individually and communally, right? I mean, I think that's the whole core of the enterprise, right? So why wouldn't we do that internally within our own systems, and not just think about the fact that, well, like we offer this and that offers, and somebody else offers something else. I think the question, we ask this question all the time, but I think it's a klutz kasha. I think it's a question that we raise only to prevent ourselves from actually doing what we all know we need to do anyway.
I'd like to pick up something that Rabbi Ruskay said about social justice, and ask the panel to reflect a little bit on this moment within American society as a moment in which I think we're kind of politically alienated from one another, the left and the right. Synagogues are made up of people who have very different ideas about perhaps how to define justice or how to express that aspiration through our political system. And so assuming that part of the job, this is my assumption now, you can disagree with it, I'm inviting you to disagree with it if you'd like, that synagogues and churches and mosques, religious communities, are one of the only places in the public conversation today where the left and the right can break bread together and support one another through challenging personal times, and to really build a community intentionally as a group, as opposed to building community just with those who reflect our own very specific politics back to us. So how would a community start to organize around a social justice issue which by so many people would be understood as politically validating one position over the other without alienating those within the community who perhaps see the situation a bit differently?
So I think one of the blessings of being in conservative communities is that we have the greatest diversity of political opinion. I think in the movements to our left and to our right, there's probably more unanimity than there is in our community. So that presents a great opportunity, an opportunity for us to be the bedrock of civil society. As you said, people coming together with vast differences politically, who consume media from completely different sources, who are able to actually have conversations with people and share values and share Shabbat community and traditions. That's keeping our country together. I don't think that's an understatement. I don't think there's many more institutions that would actually do something like that. How do you prevent fights from breaking out? I don't know. I think the challenge is how do you not settle just for that? I think that's important, but I also think it's important that people get to express their deepest held values in Jewish ways. Otherwise, they'll go elsewhere to do it. And so how do you cater to everyone? Well, I think certainly in a community of this size, you have an opportunity to create multiple communities under one roof, where you've got addresses people can go to within a Beth El umbrella to express particular values that are most important to them. So if you have, if Israel is really an important issue for you, and AIPAC represents an expression of that means something to you, you can partner with the folks at Beth El who do AIPAC and go to the policy conference. If immigration is a really important issue for you, you've got a group of people working on that. It's not that the board of directors gives its sign of approval and agreement with every single thing that's said and done in all these groups, but you have multiple ways for people to do this. And for those who feel like that's not reflective of who they are, like, yeah, I don't do the immigration thing, that's not my thing, but I do the AIPAC thing, and we all daven here on Shabbos. I think it's important that we start to create those kinds of communities where we can appreciate the difference and be in the presence of others who express things differently, and overall feel that it's important for us as a Jewish community and American community to have a place that represents civil society.
So if we can sharpen the question, because I think in addition to what you just described, Aaron, I think the question gets sharpened when it's not just, okay, the Israel organizing is going to happen around AIPAC, and if that's not my comfort zone, then I just won't participate in the Israel organizing. The question is, okay, if my Israel organizing does not draw me to AIPAC, but it draws me to J Street, right? Is there room for both an AIPAC group and a J Street group in one community? So that's how I understand the real sharpening of your question. And I was lucky enough to be able to drive up here tonight with Stephanie, and we had a chance to talk about this a little bit. So what I'm about to say, I want to also offer, on behalf of Stephanie as well, and then please elaborate. But what we talked about is how constructive it is for communities as diverse as our communities are, as I imagine this one is as well, to talk about issues not from a policy standpoint, but from a value standpoint, and to create opportunities for conversation that cut to the heart of the values that are inherent in them, and not necessarily the public policy positions that end up being concretized. So for example, if we're talking about healthcare, right, can we create a space in our communities to talk about what are the values inherent in the debate around healthcare? How is it that we want to be able to take care of the sick in our society, right? If we're talking about gun violence, instead of debating the Second Amendment, can we have a conversation about how it is that we can best keep our children safe in our country, right? There are different ways of framing those discussions which allow us to recognize that though we may come out in different places in a policy context, we may actually be driven by deeply shared values. And if we're able to have values-based conversations, we may be able to understand each other a little bit better. Maybe not agree with each other entirely, but understand each other a little bit better. And we also spoke about different organizing approaches, and I'll speak to an approach that I've been trained in recently, which is the approach offered by Marshall Gans, actually also a son of a conservative rabbi, who's a very well-known community organizer, who uses narrative as the framework for communities being able to talk about difficult and often polarizing issues. That when we are able to tell a story of self, when we're able to articulate, this is who I am, this is where I've been, these are the issues that have animated my life, the struggles with which I have engaged over the course of the years that I have been alive and been in relationship to this issue, we're able to see and honor each other's journeys in ways that starting the conversation from the policy standpoint doesn't allow us to do. And here we are, 4 days before Pesach, where we're engaging in the ultimate sacred art of narrative, of storytelling. And we understand from our own tradition how vastly more sacred our narrative portions of our tradition are than our legal portions. This is what we learn from our ancient teachers. And why is that? Right? Why doesn't the Torah start with the Ten Commandments? Why doesn't the Torah start with law? Why does it start with chapter after chapter of narrative, of telling us about the messy, complicated, right, emotionally trying efforts of human beings to live in deep relationship with one another, with the source of life, dealing with issues of family rivalries? Why do we start with that? We start with narrative because narrative sets the sacred context in which we can best understand norms, because narrative sets the most compelling context in which the norms that our communities evolve can make the most credible claim upon us. Right? We don't understand the 36 times that remember that you were a slave in Egypt is repeated in the Torah without first going through the narrative of how, in fact, we were enslaved, and therefore treat the widow, the slave, and the orphan with respect. The widow, the minor, and the orphan with respect. Right? Narrative is a critical way of developing respect, understanding, even if it doesn't necessarily develop, sameness.
I want to add, first of all, I mean, if you were expecting that there'd be a lot of differences on this panel, you're probably very disappointed.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Probably not. But what I want to add to the conversation is, much in the way in which you started and you set the ground rules for how we're going to discuss this is we've forgotten how to do that. Right? We live in a world of 280 characters, of likes and retweets, and unfortunately, much of our conversation has mirrored Facebook. And that, by the way, is not for young people. That's for us older people, right? The average age of Facebook is already people that are our age. The younger people are not on Facebook. They're on Snapchat and Instagram and whatever else is coming on, right? So we're mimicking this, and we have to reclaim a willingness to set the ground rules by how we listen to the narrative, how we have critical conversations, how we talk about values and disagree on policy, and we have to also be willing to hold each other accountable when we go beyond what are those ground rules of common decency and respect.
So let's move to the things that we're going to disagree about. Shmulik is sitting with you in your study, and Shmulik says, listen, Rabbi, I understand there's lots of different people in this synagogue, and I understand everyone's on their Jewish journey, and I understand not everybody can read Hebrew, and not everybody can tolerate a 3-hour service, and not everybody keeps kosher. I get that. But if we make changes to the traditional way of living our lives as a community, then we are abandoning the heritage that we're being called to uphold. And you think, Shmulik, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I'm a rabbi, trained in the conservative movement, shaped by these ideas and values. Great, that's a great point. And Ruvain says, well, Rabbi, I can't follow anything that's happening in services. You're completely misunderstanding my children. They would never step foot. If you want my 22-year-old and 25-year-old to step foot in your synagogue, and it looks pretty much the same way it did in 1995, it may be great for that small group of people who find what you're doing compelling, but if you don't start creating opportunities for me and my children to engage in new ways that actually look quite different than the way Shmulik envisions synagogue life, there's going to be no future for your synagogue. So how would you respond to these two people? when you feel that both of them are making credible statements and requests from you as their spiritual guide and the leader of a community.
You know, it reminds me of the old joke where you're right and you're right, but Rabbi, how can they both be right? You're right too, right? The way in which I would respond is change is already here, right? It's already here. And we already know that what is traditional for one generation of Jews is not effective for the next. So the challenge that we have to come to grips with is how do we transmit the truth of this Judaism to a new generation? And that transmission is going to be very different than the way in which we received it. And I think one of the best recent descriptions of this is Rabbi Mike Urim's new book, Generations, I think it's called, right? The Next Generation, right? He's our colleague who's the rabbi at Penn Hillel. And he basically talks about that at this moment of paradigm shifts, we have to do both. We have to be able to provide the space and the needs of a legacy generation, right, for whom Shmulek's Judaism is meaningful, and we have to also be willing to embrace and let go of that a little bit and trust that the next generation will be able to build a Judaism that is meaningful for them. And in order for them to do that, we have to give them the tools and the resources, the network and the inspiration for them to do it. Millennials, adults in their 20s and 30s, they're not coming to synagogues as we know them, right? So we need to stop asking, why don't they come, right? They're not coming, right? Instead, you got to ask, what are the ways in which we as a community can play a role in assuring the next generation finds meaning and purpose in their lives, where they are? And how do we hold both of these things at the same time? The last thing I want to say about this, which I hope will scare you a little bit, is I think we are entering the next era, the next major paradigm shift of the Jewish people, right? The first was Sinai. The first was Sinai and the Beit Mikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. When it was destroyed, the second became Rabbinic Judaism of the Talmud and the Mishnah and the language of Halakha. And the third is yet to be defined. But what we know about it already is that traditional hierarchical models of power and leadership and framing of life are gone. You don't have to look any further than the March on Washington that took place this last Shabbat. 17-year-olds had 2 million people in 800 events turn out for a march on Washington about gun safety. 17-year-olds. I was there. Not a single adult from the podium spoke. Not a single one. Not a single politician was there giving them platitudes or false promises or so forth and so on. It was 17-year-olds. Right? 17, 18, 19-year-olds, a couple 11-year-olds, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s granddaughter at 9 years old. Right? 2 million people came out for this around the world, 800 events. Right? If you don't look at that and recognize that there is something profoundly different about this next generation, and in some ways I think the best thing we can do is get out of their way and give them the resources to build something meaningful, then I'm sorry, you're just not going to be able to really think about what this journey means and what a transition and transformation and what does it mean to build sacred community into the next generation. I mean, it's staring us all in the face. We really have to pay attention.
I'll add a couple of things. I come at this as a rabbi, but also as a community organizer, and I would say to those two people, I would agitate them a little bit and say, well, so what are you, if this really matters to you, what are you personally willing to do? And who are you willing to get to do this with you? Because I think Aaron's right that you do want to have a roof that has many different micro-communities in it. But that it takes, there's a challenge of having professionalized Judaism in lots of ways. So all of us are professionally Jewish, right? We all have leadership roles in Jewish communities, and that's really great to have gotten to a place where our communities need people who it's their full-time work and calling to focus on how a community is being nourished and grown and developing. However, it's not right if what happens then is everyone thinks like, oh, they've got this, and so we just show up, because then it's just an anemic version of Judaism and community, and you have to disorganize and reorganize. And so part of it is, like, if both people really feel like that, I think there's room for both of them at Beth El, but I think that they have to find their people with your support and organizing training to figure out, how do I go from feeling kind of dissatisfied about something and passionate about it to turning it into something that's slightly different. The other thing I wanted to say is, I work at JTS, which is a legacy organization, but we're very much in a moment of innovation in lots of different ways. So we have a millennial engagement project that has a couple of parts. One part is we send students out regularly to college campuses. And we chose places that are like, you could take the bus, because we don't have that much money in the grants, so you can take a bus 8 times during the year from JTS. They go to places where there are a lot of kids who were raised in our movement. There's a lot of Orthodox staff on those campuses and not a lot of vibrant egalitarian Jewish life. And so I feel like if we're not there, they're taking a whole stage of their life when they're not feeling supported by us. They don't have any imagination about what egalitarian Jewish life as a young adult looks like, and there's very little chance that when they finish, they're going to say, let me go look for that. Let me go join a shul anywhere. So we're doing some stuff on campus, but we're also trying something next year in Harlem. We're going to do a local laboratory that sort of calls on 2 different models. One is Beth Hillel, and one is Moshe House. Are people familiar with those? Some no. So a very quick, Beth Hillel is rabbinic couples have a house, a bayit, a home base, and they do teaching and learning and Shabbat hosting and social justice programming in their house. And the idea is young people are not going to go to shul, or some of them will, but we also care about the ones who won't. And so we're going to create a community of people that is home-based. And Moshe House is similar, but there's not rabbinic families there. There are millennials who get rent subsidies and they build their own programming. And so it's sort of determined by whatever the interests of the people living in the house is. So we're going to try sort of a JTS version of that gives our students an opportunity to be in a house where they're doing the hosting and teaching and leading and cultivating a community. It's not to say like, oh, don't do shuls. It's to say like, and shuls are really important and there's more, and we have to train you in order to be able to do this work. And we also have to just create it and see what happens, because we don't actually know what will happen.
Thank you. I want to pick up on something that Rabbi Wernick said to kind of pose as the next question, which is, if we actually did step aside, right? We're saying the next generation is coming forth. We have to trust in their creative power and their sincerity in building something profound and meaningful. I think if I could interview many of the people who fall into that category, they would say some version to me, and this is a question that's emerged in our own process. Well, okay, if I'm going to build something, why do I have to be a part of a movement? Why do I have to do that according to the bylaws of this organization and make sure that these the bylaws that we create here reflect some larger set of principles of another organization? Just give me the free reins and let me build something beautiful here. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question distilled into one sentence would be, do you believe there's value in saying I want to put forth the resources of this community to affiliate specifically with the movement, in particular the conservative movement? And if there's value in making that resource allocation, how do we explain that value to the larger, the numbers of people who are walking into this door and to whom we are trying to make a compelling home?
So is that question for me?
Well, no, I have a feeling we may disagree, and I thought you were inviting some disagreement. So I don't mean you and I just mean the panel may disagree on that question.
I'm going to step out here and, first of all, acknowledge that I serve two communities, neither of whom are affiliated with the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Sha'ar communities, which I founded and lead in northern New Jersey, and also, B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan. But I was a card-carrying member for a long time. Further disclosure, I withdrew my membership from the Rabbinical Assembly about 3 years ago in order to be able to stand by and officiate for multi-faith and multi-heritage couples who were committed to living Jewish lives and raising Jewish families. And I opened the panel conversation by articulating a whole variety of values that I think are so powerful and so compelling about the conservative movement. So though I am no longer card-carrying, I do very much still draw great inspiration from the conservative movement. And I will just add one more thing from my own story. I was born and raised in the modern Orthodox community of Montreal. And I had to leave home, metaphorically, and on some levels also very concretely, to come home to the conservative movement. So my decision to leave home once again was not without deep, deep, deep struggle and tremendous pain. I share that by way of offering a response to your question, which is that if our institutions are prepared to continue to be the sources of inspiration and affirmation and validation for the many and varied Jewish journeys that we as rabbis are privileged to be leading for people, if we are truly able to not just say life has changed, but to examine the ways in which life has changed, to truly negotiate the realities of the fact that identity today is something that has become fluid, hybrid, that our children, the next generation, live not just in the vast marketplace of ideas, but truly within the vast marketplace of identities. We're in a time that many have described as post-ethnic, where we really have to do business with the question of what role particularism and ethnicity play in a post-ethnic world. If we are really prepared to look at how our institutions as they currently exist are not meeting the spiritual needs of so many amongst our people and those who are part of our people today, if we're really prepared to reimagine what the landscape of Jewish institutional life can look like, if we're prepared to accept that we no longer have issues around which we as a Jewish people, a more diverse Jewish people than we've ever been, can truly cohere. Israel is no longer the rallying cry that holds us together. If we're prepared to acknowledge and embrace and live with that diversity, and if the conservative movement is prepared to deploy all of those resources and assets that we all spoke about, and that I spoke about right off the bat here, then I think there could be tremendous value in being part of a movement that's willing to lead, to get ahead of these issues, and to offer what I think the conservative movement continues to have to offer, but isn't at the moment offering it: the most exciting, the most grounded, the most promising, the most traditional in its very ability to be courageous and inventive approach to 21st century Jewish life. Sadly, I don't think we're living our legacy. So I understand the question. But does the conservative movement have the capacity to lead in that way and to offer the most inspiring vision of Jewish life in the 21st century? I continue to say yes. And I continue to miss home.
So here's where I'm going to be both provocative and a little bit vulnerable, right? So I'm going to take you up, Rabbi Shuck, on what you said. I agree, right? And I want to say that the notion of a movement, I find unfortunately is a facade, because the movement is really only the network of the congregations. So if the movement's not living up to the vision that was just presented, it's because our congregations aren't doing so. And how do we, how the challenge that I have at USCJ is how do we create a platform where these kinds of conversations take place and where we can share the successes and the failures that those congregations that are moving towards that kind of vision are dealing with. And that's what we're trying to do, right? I mean, if you go and you look at the agenda at the last convention about Dare Together, right? We chose that theme very specifically, right? We have to have the courage to change the paradigm. We have to dare together into the future. And if you look at the list of the speakers that came and the topics that were going on, it was basically a macro. It's basically a macro vision of the conversation that we're having here, with people that come in from the different types of communities that we've assembled as well, and even beyond that. People from within the conservative movement from an institutional perspective, and people that are inspired by conservative Judaism and fulfilling it outside of it. Right? So we're having the conversations about multi-faith activities. USCJ's leading those conversations amongst the congregations. We changed the bylaws about issues of membership. We had a conversation at our convention with Yehuda Kurtzer about 3 different levels of identity as one possibility in terms of how do we deal with the issue of intermarriage in our time. And so forth and so on, right? So I mean, there is no movement other than the movement that the congregations themselves collectively do, and USCJ is trying to reposition itself into a platform by which those conversations can happen, and we can build coalitions that are going to dare together into the future. That's one. 2, here's where I get vulnerable, right? I believe in the core and the essence of my own being and my own experience in the value of endogamy, that the best way to assure a Jewish future is when 2 Jewish people in a loving relationship get married and have a family and create a Jewish home. That being said, I'm not sure that position is sustainable into the future. And it's not just about what's happening here in North America. Birthright. Right? Birthright has sent 500,000 people to Israel since its founding, right? Young adults. At this moment in time, the vast majority of people that are going are coming from the former Soviet Union. And only 25% of them are people that we would consider to be halakhically Jewish. So think about what this means for a minute. The state of Israel is investing, right? North American Jewry is investing. Right? The entire Jewish world is investing in bringing people to Israel based on a Jewish identity that follows the law of return, one Jewish grandparent. Right? You have tens of thousands of people that are coming to Israel wearing crosses, right? Because they view it as a good luck charm because one of their non-Jewish parents have given it to them. Right? And then when they go back to the former Soviet Union, it's not just in the former Soviet Union, it's really all around the world, South America too, maybe not so much in Europe, but in South America as well. When they go back, the Jewish people are investing in creating Jewish experiences for them in their host communities and encouraging them to come back on Masa and have extended periods in Israel and then make Aliyah to Israel. Right? So on the one hand, we have a real problem about conversion and Jewish identity, not only in North America, but also around the world. Tens of thousands of people being encouraged in their Jewish identity that is not halakhic by the state of Israel and the Jewish people through these millions of dollars of investment. And then on the other hand, you have these people that are now, being motivated and so forth. So project that out to what does that look like 10, 15, 20 years from now, right? I don't know how we solve this problem, right? Again, this is where I'm vulnerable. I don't know how we solve this problem. In my core, I believe and advocate and support the notion of endogamy. But what I do know for sure is that we can no longer ignore it. And we can no longer pretend that Jewish identity is changing in ways that make many of us uncomfortable. And so that's where I'm vulnerable. right? I can identify where the issue is. I can see how it's being impacted all around the world. I see the investment on one hand, but yet the denial on the other. I just think this problem is going to become more complex, and we have to put it on the table, and we have to talk honestly about it.
Thank you. Rabbi Brousseau, did you want to say something?
What was the question?
Okay, that's my cue. I have a number, we're moving into the Q&A here, and I have a number of questions that I'm going to try to synthesize a bit. And they're it's kind of interesting to watch the questions come in because they're grouped in some ways. So I think this question actually, I'm going to read it as I have it because I think it captures the spirit of many of these questions, which is, does halachic pluralism include a non-halachic branch? So halakha is Jewish law, just to make sure we're on the same page. So the question is, if we talk about halachic pluralism, how does one define the boundaries of what is acceptable within that pluralism, and would it accept a vision of Jewish life that actually does not feel bound to the boundaries of halakha?
So I'm happy, Steve, to discover that we are interested in something very similar in terms of drawing the arc of the paradigm shifts that have animated Jewish life and where we are right now. The language with which I have spoken and taught and written about the paradigm shifts that we're undergoing right now is moving from the earliest iteration of Jewish life, which was bound by the concepts temple-based, Mishkan-based, and then temple-based, the desert sanctuary, and then the sanctuary in Jerusalem, between Tum'ah and Tahara, between impurity and purity. And with the fall of the temple, we move into another paradigm. You refer to it as Rabbinic Judaism. I explicate it as the paradigm of mutar and asur, of permitted and forbidden, right? A system of Rabbinic Judaism that was predicated on an acceptance of rabbinic authority. And the simple fact is that beginning a few hundred years ago, the Enlightenment, emancipation, right? Fast forward to today, we no longer live in a Jewish world that submits to the paradigm of mutar and asur, of permitted and forbidden, of rabbinic authority. Fealty to Jewish observance, commitment to Jewish ritual, robust prayer lives are all meaningful expressions of Jewish life for many people. But to say that a life bound by a prescription of Jewish law is the only authentic way to live a Jewish life is quite simply to write out of Judaism the vast plurality of Jews today. So personally, I continue to live and teach and hopefully inspire Jewish lives that take seriously Jewish ritual, the ongoing observance of Jewish tradition. But I acknowledge that there are many other ways to build deep, authentic, meaningful expressions of Jewish identity. Look, we're very comfortable referring to ourselves as, I'm a religious Jew, I'm a cultural Jew, I'm a secular Jew, I'm a Zionist Jew, right? On and on and on and on. Right? We know that there are many and varied ways in which people embody deep commitment to Jewish values and to Jewish identity. What we haven't done is invest as much in the way of resources, education, creativity, and innovation in creating a thickness to those other identities such that they can be transmittable, not to the next generation, but to the third generation. Right? That's the mark, social scientists will tell you, of a viable identity, when it can be transmitted not to your children, but to your grandchildren. So I think it's incumbent upon us not only to recognize that there are many other pathways to a rich Jewish life, in addition to a path that is immersed, steeped in ritual observance and halachic observance, but we have to go one step further and invest in creating the deep, immersive, educationally driven opportunities for those other pathways to take on the same thickness, the same seriousness, the same commitment. Right? So that when I ask the question, okay, we have emerged from purity and impurity, and we've emerged from permitted and forbidden, what is the next great iteration of the Jewish paradigm? We no longer live in a world of binaries. We no longer live in a world of in and out. We live in a world of yes and. We live in a world that is hybrid, that is fluid. So to me, one piece of it, right, the next great iteration is not going to be made up of oppositional binaries. To me, the next great iteration has within it, I think, kavanah, intention, right? I'm going back to my tradition to pull a word that I think still has great resonance today, the intentionality with which we want people to live their Jewish lives. And what's the partner pole to that? Right? In whatever expression, the partner pole, to me, has to have something to do with an abiding commitment to that Jewish expression. Right? Can't be episodic. An abiding, daily commitment to that Jewish expression. And I think community also has to play an enormous role. Because Judaism is not, right, a one-player enterprise.
I think it also depends where you are geographically when you ask that question, right? So if you're the only shul in town, then for sure there's a place for a not halachically committed group within your shul. And if you have a shul like down the block, that might be a better fit, then you have less of an obligation to be investing in that. And so I guess the question is also, as you think about where you are now and where you think you'll be as a community in 20 years, who's living here, what other shulas are around, and is it your, do you want to invest in raising that up here also, or do you want to say, actually there is another place where they would be a great fit, and so we're going to focus on not having that here?
I also think in our own communities, sometimes non-halachic is a kind of way of saying different than I'm used to, or I don't know if I want to think too hard about that, so I'm going to give it sort of this label, or it scares me. So I don't know what non-halachic means without a conversation or specifically saying what issue we're talking about. I mean, I learned that at, my second year of being a rabbi at Kiddush, when someone comes up to you and says, Rabbi, I have a hypothetical question. And it's never hypothetical. It's about a very personal, difficult, emotional issue, and now you've given your hypothetical answer. So it's like, what's the issue, and who are we talking about, and are we prepared to delve into it instead of labeling it as mutar and asur?
So I want to just add to sort of deepen this. The overwhelming majority of little green cards I have here are actually speaking to this question, but I want to fine-tune it a bit with the language that I'm hearing from people listening to the four of you. Which is a lack of clarity about the Judaism that we are hearing tonight, and how that differs from Reform Judaism.
So that's what I was going to go. Quite frankly, I think that the language of halakha also has been hijacked by even an ultra-orthodoxy, right? And so it's all today about what's in and what's out, mutar and asur, what's permitted and what's prohibited. The fact that you call the visioning process that you're doing, the journeying, Beth El journeying, I think that's really important, right? Because you're already labeling a value, and I'm the Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's the chair of the Jewish Law. The Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, which is a committee that needs a new name, would even say that there is no non-halakha because Jewish choices are halakha in general, which has me think that we need a new language then. And so the language that I'm thinking about is hadracha, right, which is about journeying, and where the job of rabbis and Jewish educators and clergy and so forth is about being a madrich. And one of the skill sets that we need to learn in seminary is really how do we become spiritual life coaches to people, right? And so then the question becomes, well, so then now we get back to, you're not Reform, you're not Orthodox, you're not Milchiks, you're not Fleischiks, you're Parv. You can eat it, but who really wants to? So I think that what defines us are the types of commitments that we heard, right? That we understand that the fullest expression of Jewish life is both its authenticity and its dynamism, that it's yes and, right? I'm going to read to you a little bit from Zach Zabib, who's the international president of USY, and he wrote this on his blog. I think we published it today or yesterday, after the March on Washington. Our goal, when our teenagers came to us and said, we want to be in D.C., this is important to us, we want USY to support us, and we want to have Shabbat and the march, right? So that's what we did for them. We had 200 kids with us around the nation in D.C. We have 1,000 people that we know of that joined us in 7 or 8 different locations across the United States, Israel, and Berlin, actually, right? So here's what he wrote afterwards. He says, it was Shabbat, so we had to find a way to juxtapose our values, sanctifying Shabbat with our values of social activism. The tension between being involved and keeping Shabbat completely enhanced our experience. Our march did not start on Pennsylvania Avenue. Rather, it started 2.5 miles away right after Shacharit services at Addis Israel Congregation in D.C. In the interest of keeping Shabbat, a group of us walked to the march. As we walked to the march site, we were praised by drivers honking at us and waving their hands. It felt not only as if the older generations were proud of us, but they were now trusting us to lead the charge. When we got to the march site on Pennsylvania Avenue, we couldn't take any pictures because it was Shabbat. Instead, we made memories that would be more impactful than a picture. We marched behind our banner, singing songs like Ozi V'Zimrat Shah, praising the strength of God, and Oseh Shalom, praying for a day when we would not have to march to ensure the freedom and security of our brothers and sisters and communities across the country. Right? That's what sets us apart. Right? It's that kind of commitment, right, that sets us apart. Right? And so, we got to stop, falling into the trap of those false comparisons today, of a binary, it's either Reform or Orthodox, or it's Parv, right? And we have to stop apologizing for who we are, and we need to, as we heard, we need to radically increase our investments in those things that we know add thickness to the Jewish experience, right? I mean, one quick example, right? We know, everything we know is that teens, right, teen engagement post-B'nai Mitzvah leads to greater engagement in college and young adulthood and then into adulthood, right? We know that. Every single piece of data for 30 years has done that. But yet, only 8% of our synagogues have a full-time youth director, and only 12% have anybody full-time paying attention to teens. Right? So how do we expect to add thickness to these conversations if less than 20% of our congregations are investing in the things that we know through data that provide the outcomes that we're talking about? Right? So, I mean, we have the ability to do it. We just have to have the courage to dare together.
I want to just add my voice for a second, not as moderator, and then jump back in. By the way, Erica Leventhal told me I had to sit on that chair because I insisted on having it up there because I was going to sit up there or it would look weird that I didn't sit up there. I'm not sitting up there, but I should have. It would look less weird, I acknowledge. I want to say I have strong feelings about one of the things that I'm seeing in these note cards and hearing is a real fear that equates halachic pluralism with a rejection of the importance of traditional Judaism. And I want to state really clearly that I don't actually see the two in conflict. that halachic pluralism, at least in my understanding, is that we invest our resources, our time, our professional staff, our organizing within the community to strengthen and grow traditional egalitarian Jewish expression within our communities, while simultaneously creating spaces for people to enter into serious Jewish engagement who are not going to show up to the traditional egalitarian expressions of Judaism. And I understand the fear that I think a lot of people are hearing, that this means that we're no different than Reform Judaism. And I just want to say that I think that the problem in the conversation is when we decide that creating space for multiple expressions of Judaism means abandoning traditional Judaism. I'm speaking now for myself, believe that in 2018, a conservative synagogue that abandons investing and growing a traditional egalitarian Judaism is doing a disservice to the Jewish people and to our communities. So, and I do not see any conflict in at the same time acknowledging that that is not going to work for everyone within our communities. We know that that's the truth of the experience at Beth El, and we ought to be paying close attention to asking the question of how to engage other people who are not fitting in to traditional Judaism, not instead of the traditional Jewish expressions, but in addition to. Okay, I'm now putting my moderator hat back on for 4 minutes. That was my little sermon of the evening. I want to, there's been a bunch of questions up here that are, I'm guessing that each of you have had experiences as in your rabbinic work of working with Jewish either young adults or Jews who have been so turned on and impassioned about Jewish observance that they have found that our communities, which may be liberalizing, can no longer serve their needs and find themselves in modern Orthodox, or what was called in one of these cards, open Orthodox communities. So the question is, and I'm gonna put another question on top of it, which is, what do we do to both create the kinds of communities that you're describing, while also trying to keep the people who actually hear the message and become excited about and passionate about Jewish observance but can't find a home within our communities in terms of other people observing in the way that they do? And where is God in the discussion of conservative Judaism? I just dumped that in. I'm not sure the two are exactly connected, but I think you can answer either one of them, and you have 3 minutes. Total. You each have 40 seconds.
Well, I would say when I said earlier a sense of commandedness was part of what I felt sets us apart as a movement. It's like the end of that is like commanded to who? God. So to me, I was shortening it a little bit, but I think that actually is a key feature that separates us from other movements. But I think that this is a time in the world of collaboration. And so I love that Aaron is here from a neighboring community. And I think like if your communities both have kids who went on programs that were immersive and came back feeling like I can't find my thing right here, that this is the time in the world when we collaborate and find ways that those kids get put together from the communities and have opportunities at both places, because there's more of them when you join them.
I actually brought God into my very first statement, although maybe not in the way that you would have wanted, when I said that I think one of the strengths of the conservative Jewish tradition is a commitment to theological diversity, in understanding that nobody knows exactly who or what or if God is, but that we all seek to live in some kind of deep and righteous relationship with the source of life, however that may be embodied for each of us. You know, I want to echo something and push it a little further, what Stephanie just said. I think we ought to celebrate the fact that there are not just many and varied pathways to Jewish life in a way that we can hold them here in a conservative synagogue, but that there are many and varied pathways to Jewish life, period. And that, you know, if there is someone who doesn't find what they're seeking here, I think, you know, we should be thankful that there are other communities which may meet their needs in more meaningful ways. But I think we're talking about something very specific in terms of creating communities that can not just tolerate but celebrate the fact that not everybody will be drawn to Jewish life in the same manner. And that, you know, I just want to give you an example because I feel like we keep talking in generalities. The community that I founded and run in northern New Jersey called Sha'ar Communities, Sha'ar means gate in the singular, communities in the plural, intentionally named that way because we wanted to convey that there is a sacredness and a sufficiency and an authenticity to each single portal into Jewish life that we try to create in Sha'ar Communities. Sha'ar Communities is essentially a deconstructed synagogue, recognizing that people do come to Judaism from many different values, priorities, and interests. We created a network of self-standing communities, each of which revolves around a different mode of Jewish expression. So we have a community that meets for prayer, and we have a community that meets for study, and we have a community that meets for social action, and a community that travels all over the world and uses travel as a setting for spiritual reflection and growth. But I'm not sitting in a class that I'm teaching and saying, wonderful, we've just had this great class, you really should be in shul on Shabbos morning. I'm recognizing that I'm teaching a group of people for many of whom, study is what puts fire in their belly Jewishly, and the people sitting around the table become their community. When I'm sitting and talking to people or working with people on social action, right, I'm not suggesting that they necessarily should be coming to Torah study on Tuesday morning. But at the same time, I'm not losing the opportunity to say to them, okay, so Shabbat is not necessarily a time when you're going to restrict yourselves according to the dictates of halakha, but what can Shabbat mean for people for whom engaging in social action is the way in which they feel most authentically connected to their Jewish values? We don't just throw out Shabbat. What might a Friday night look like for a family that is galvanized around healing the world? What might Shabbat morning look like? Where should that family be? What kind of study can they perhaps engage in together? What kind of rituals can they develop in order to bring some gravitas and that thickness that we're talking about so that their family's tradition can be transmitted? Right? So it's not a, you know, okay, so you have somebody who wants an Orthodox community, right? It's not, we should celebrate the fact that there are these many different pathways. But what you're talking about, I think, is something different. How many pathways can you hold in the singular embrace of your community?
The question, you know, look, the question gets back to this notion of denominationalism again. And so, you know, we get stuck in it, right? And you know, I think that we should celebrate the deepening commitments that people make and the homes that they find within the Jewish world. We should start looking at them as success and not as a loss. That's one. Two is, I think philosophers worry about God, but people worry about divine experiences, and so I'm still inspired by Heschel's notion of radical amazement, of being able to train ourselves to appreciate the grandeur of this world and to recognize how incredible it is, and that for the religious mindset that is godliness. Right, and so I think it's about experience, it's about shared experience, and framing them in ways that allow for that godliness to be shared and internalized in some way, shape, or form. And then finally, what I would say about this is that you know, at the end of the day, to get back to the first point, at the end of the day, we're all seeking meaning together, and you know, if we can help people, you know, as I said, if we can help guide people to find meaning and to see the richness of Jewish tradition, of Jewish learning, of Jewish spirituality, of social justice through a Jewish lens, you know, at the end of the day, it's still the four pillars, right? It's Torah, Avodah, spirituality, Gimlut Chasadim, social justice, and Chevra. relationship. All thriving communities that we see today share a kavanah, an intentionality around Jewish relevancy and relationship, and they align everything they do towards those goals. And they measure it so they know what they're accomplishing.
Great. And Stephanie Ruskay, Rabbi Ruskay, have the last word.
All right.
I thought you wanted
I
one.
do have a word.
Okay, a word. 40 seconds.
So I have a feeling that at some moment you're going to call the question of, so are we in the movement, are we out of the movement? Not tonight, but long-term in your process. And I wanted to say that I think we'll be a better movement if you stay. And that when I thought about taking my job, so I'm the Associate Dean in the Rabbinical School at JTS, and I had always thought that I was an outside the system person who was going to agitate from outside from all of these different social justice organizations. And I thought, like, if this is a chance to come to the inside and actually have an impact on the questions that are going to keep me up at night anyway, because I'm going to worry about the future of the movement. I'm going to worry about who rabbis will be serving and how they will be trained. I'm going to worry. So why don't I be in a place where I can have an influence over it? And so I feel like this is a moment. I mean, we all came here to talk with you. And you actually have tons of power in the thinking about where's the movement going. And in some ways, it's like up to your creativity and decision to like sort of be proactive changers with the partners here and other places about shaping the future. Because we don't know exactly what it looks like, but we all decided to be part of shaping it. So thanks for the last word.
Rabbi Brusso is telling me he has the
He has
last
the
word.
last
Yeah. I think the institutions of our movement are important. I don't know who's going to recreate those and that with our same value system if we don't support them. I do think that's critical. And I don't think you should worry about the movement as you go through your process. I think you should worry about making this an incredibly dynamic and engaging community. And you can't do better than Rabbi Shuck. He's the most amazing, incredible. Like, I mean, if you want Mashiach, go look for it. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he's literally right there. So, and I think that's the formula, which is just focus on
That's the formula.
on what is so exciting and engaging about being here, and keep doing those things, and it's going to contribute to the vibrancy of something larger by definition. And I want to take issue a bit with what Rabbi Luda said. I think that there are many vibrant synagogues that our colleagues are leading in brave and forward-thinking and innovative and traditional ways. And we can list them and name them. And there are a number of success stories around this country. And I think that I would count Beth El as one of them.
Thank you. I want to thank
Thanks for having us.
our panelists. Don't get up yet. Incredibly, very, very grateful for your time and for your openness and for your energy and your thinking.